Here this year from Bloomsbury Publishing. John is here to discuss the prospects for a Marxism that recognizes the horrific, the monstrous, and the Gothic in capitalism. How monsters are produced under capital, what potentials they hold for emancipatory thought, and how to stand in solidarity with those monstered by the social conditions of our time. Also in the mix is Adam, Will, and Matt. John, welcome to Acid Horizon.
Thank you so much for having me on the show. Very excited to be here.
Great. So, John, first things first. If one has read the work of Marx, particularly Capital or Das Kapital, we of course encountered his copious horror metaphors. The record reflects that Marx was also an avid reader of horror and Shakespeare. How did you develop an affinity with this aspect of Marx's work, his allusions to horror, and why have you made it a focus of your own writing?
So I started as doing a PhD in 19th century Gothic literature, which mostly involved sort of procrastinating and reading a lot of Marxist theory. One day on YouTube, I stumbled across a talk given by the author ᴛɪᴄᴏ, which used the phrase Gothic Marxism, which was sort of like a kind of subconscious trigger phrase. It was like being activated as like a sleeper agent. And it's one of those, it's a kind of like moment of epiphany. I like thinking about it in kind of non-rational terms. You know, like the Gothic story is always you find a kind of forbidden tome in an old abandoned library, and you blow the dust off the covers, and it unlocks something in your mind. From watching that talk, it's called, I think, Halloween and Marxism, and you can find it on YouTube. I had understood myself as a Marxist for a long time, but the interest in Gothic literature was always kind of like, in the Gothic or in things which were kind of dark or horrifying or non-rationalist was always a kind of part of my interests. And there didn't seem to be a way of bridging that gap. Marxism was scientific, you know, it was a rationalist theory of social and historical development. And so having a strictly materialist or strictly kind of like rationalist Marxist frame means that huge amounts of human experience and particularly human culture are not really comprehensible as anything other than a kind of superstition that has to be discarded by the ever-perfecting teleology of historical materialism. But that doesn't seem satisfying kind of either intellectually or aesthetically. And so watching that talk led me to things like Margaret Cohen's work on André Breton and Walter Benjamin. It led into David McNally's work on culture and political economy. And I think this is a kind of area that's still kind of under-theorized. There are a couple of ways that you can kind of do it, but I think it has a great... The reason I like it and the reason I think it's effective is that it has great explanatory potential, right? So especially for people who are not already like theory heads, who would not consider themselves Marxist or communist or even particularly politically radical. So I have my own, I am the co-host of the Horror Vanguard. We jokingly talk about three things: friendship, really scary movies, and how communism is good. The three most important things. And right, horror movies have this great explanatory potential for allowing people to comprehend their social, historical, cultural, and political conditions in relation to something like a kind of Marxist critique of political economy, without expecting them to become conversant with the kind of philosophical or quite dry rationalist language of what Margaret Cohen would call vulgar Marxism. So I kind of hope that opens the door to like how and why a kind of Gothic Marxism was initially appealing.
That's one of the things that McNally talks about in his book too, is why an analysis of capitalism by Marx, it's almost necessary that we have something like a metaphor to analyze the commodity form, because of the doubling that occurs in the creation of a commodity through the doubling of value, use value and exchange value, the obscuring of the creation of the commodity, and the various other obscurings that happen in virtue of the proliferation of capital. And I'm curious to what extent your interaction with McNally's work has influenced your own foray into this material.
Okay, so what's super interesting about kind of talking about Gothic Marxism is that it immediately, the Gothic is great at hybridizing, just as a cultural form, right? It opens into many different directions. And so there is not a single Gothic Marxism, but there are Gothic Marxisms So the value of David McNally's work, Monsters of the Market, is actually, I think, a really good and sort of underappreciated book, is in its understanding of capitalism as possessing a particular phenomenology, right? What is the conscious experience of existence?
Mm.
And the direct route here back to Marx is maybe not the slightly more abstract economic theory of the occult powers of the commodity, but is on sections on the fight for the working day, or conditions in factories. So like the violence of capitalism that's inflicted upon working people, right? The fact that capitalism will crush your hands, it will like ruin your body. There is something monstrous about that. And I think McNally says that like body panics are endemic to capitalism, panics around the body. And however that might be the working body, it's often, as Silvia Frederici points out, it's often a gendered body.
Mm.
But the phenomenology of capitalism is what I think McNally is really good on. A kind of slightly different branch that we could look at is something like Margaret Cohen's work on the mediation between economic base and cultural superstructure. The kind of work that emerges, my own sense of things is like a properly Gothic Marxism emerges primarily out of French surrealism. Like people like Andre Breton, who the fabulous quote of the need for a Marxist myth that could counter what he called the myth of Odin, which is fascism. And that kind of links up to the kind of bigger utopian project of somebody like the German heterodox Marxist Ernst Bloch, who I think is a kind of a next cornerstone. So McNally's work is really good on kind of grounding capitalism, not as an abstract set of social conditions, even though it is that, but on something that is kind of fundamentally lived through and in. And that proceeding from the body allows us a kind of direct connection with what does it actually feel like to live through these systemic, and as I point out in one piece, essentially traumatic structural forces that make up contemporary capitalism, capitalist development.
If you don't mind, I'd like to actually pursue that point a little bit, because one of the things that you highlight in McNally's work is this notion of the invisibility of the monsters. That section in your blog, which we'll have in the show notes, that stands out to me was that section on body image. And as I was reading more of your material, I saw a pronounced commitment to the notions of base and superstructure. I mean, for those of us who are really invested in reading Deleuze and Guattari, we may be less inclined to go to those concepts. On the body image issue, what it made me think about Instagram today and the way that the projection of certain kinds of bodies causes anxiety. And I'm wondering to what extent that you feel that things like that are an epiphenomenon of capitalism, or how are we to think about that in terms of a Gothic Marxism?
Yeah, it's about how monsters are rendered, right? Monsters depend upon a kind of violation or a kind of shattering of a kind of epistemological norm. Jeffrey Cohen has a great short essay called Seven Theses on Monsters, where they point out that monsters are both harbingers of something new. As he puts it, they're both a warning and a sign. So they're a warning against something, but they are also the point at which something new emerges into kind of conscious existence. The great example here is Frankenstein's creature, right? Frankenstein's creature is something new, but is horrifying precisely in its recognizability. What makes Frankenstein's creature monstrous to its creator is the very closeness to itself, right? It's because the true horror for Victor Frankenstein about his creation is that the creation can speak eloquently, rationally, can partake in the same norms of discourse. So I guess the commitment to base and superstructure is a way of trying to kind of answer that problem of like, how do we ground the critique of capitalism in something that is not lost in the abstract, right? I think talking about economic base is one thing, but talking about the individual superstructural experience, which is a bit of a clunky way to put it, but hopefully makes sense. So something like Instagram, right? Obviously, the hierarchical static model of the base and superstructure has been relentlessly and rightly critiqued for its economism, its determinism. People like Raymond Williams in the UK, Deleuze Guattari, countless others have kind of like re-theorized the exact relationship. But I think, to me personally, I think the most helpful term is Benjamin's emphasis on mediations, right?
Mm.
That way we don't commit ourselves to the sin of diagrams, but we have a way of kind of thinking through the process.
Yeah.
And now that mediation is focalized and brought to a point in the construction, not just of a particular kind of body, like an Instagram picture, but a particular kind of body in experience, like a body in motion through both a physical and virtual space. And if we want to kind of connect that back to the Gothic, what the Gothic depends upon a kind of spatial enclosure. And I mean that in the kind of classic sense, right? In the late 18th, early 19th century, it was about being confined within a particular environment, in contradistinction to science fiction, which is forward in time and outward in space. The Gothic is a historical because it goes backwards in time and contracts into a very tight space. And aren't we all trapped? Aren't we all trapped? The joke of like, oh, you'll never log off Twitter. You'll never log off, right? Like you go, oh, trapped on the hell site. It's like, yes, no, that take that a little more seriously and actually think, like, we live in a kind of like a vast monetized digital panopticon, a great crumbling haunted castle. Just because it isn't a physical ruin doesn't mean we can't still kind of conceptualize it with those tools, right?
Adam, you had something.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really great way of putting it, especially in terms of the idea of it being both a sign and a return. I think it really fits into the logic of the return of the repressed. I mean, monster comes from sort of the same root as demonstration. And it's thinking about the Frankenstein's monster, the original title of the book, Frankenstein, the modern Prometheus. It's the return of this repressed idea about what does it mean to create life, what does it mean to create intelligence, and what are the consequences of this fire ending up and kind of burning you. And I think this is also part of the problem with certain readings of Marxism. It's kind of the return of the repressed in the same way that religion makes its return. Because, religion isn't just the opium of the people in the vulgar term, it's also the soul of the soulless world. It is the production in experience of people who have nowhere to turn to but this higher level in some readings of Marx. And it's production of this. The monster is not only a production of capitalism but a victim of it. And this does show in some great ways in somewhat contemporary horror movies. So I think of a movie came out recently called Cured, or The Cured. It's about what happens after a zombie infection. It's this movie set in Northern Ireland about what happens after they cure all these zombies and they're made sort of second-class citizens. And there's that great distinction between the capital itself is a kind of monster. We live in monstrous times, but monstrosity isn't simply the mode of production, but also a way in which production reproduces itself in these monstrous circumstances and monstrous kind of bodies, kinds of beings. So we even see some sort of the Red Scare, invasion of the body snatchers, the zombies archetype of these ravenous hordes taken by this virus, which is a rewriting of the social code. It rewrites DNA into its own sort of manifold way of doing things and then sends out into the world to reproduce itself. But one of the most interesting discussions of a monster figure that I saw in your pieces was The Witch, also read through the famous movie The Vivitch, which is apparently about witches. But if you could sort of elaborate on the sort of the figure of the witch, and particularly in relation to production, and I guess Silvia Federici's work on the matter.
I mean, yeah, this is nothing original, right? Silvia Federici got here first. This idea that monsters have a kind of political expediency from the maintenance of hegemony, right? The capitalism presents itself as both universal and completely natural. There's this great headline from the Daily Mail talking about Sally Rooney in terror because Sally Rooney's novels suggest that money is a social construct. It's like, oh, no. And so like the obvious question here is like, if money isn't a social construct, if that isn't a social construct, what does the Daily Mail think that money is?
Blood.
So it's blood. It grows on trees. It's gold that we dig out of the earth, right? That's what it is. Money in this kind of like ideological scheme is completely natural. It is a physically existing phenomena out there in the world. And monsters, or the figure of the monster, is so useful because even on some level, it shows the space in which capitalist territorialization is not entirely and totally complete. So Caliban and the Witch, even though it's come in for some critiques of its historical veracity, which fair enough, I'm not a historian, so I won't speak to, posits the idea of the witch as the woman with power that does not depend upon capitalist labor, right? Magic can heal you without having to pay for a doctor or an apothecary. You can have more bountiful crops through herb and ritual and sacrifice. Monsters then stand on the outside here, and this is where I believe there is a kind of utopian element to them, because they point to the possibility of denaturalizing capitalism, right? Showing its limitation, showing the potential kind of areas in which there are kind of weaknesses in its totalizing.
Yeah, I think there's the witch as a mode of production can not only return to show you sort of the origins of capitalism and its most ruthless forms of primitive accumulation, but also I think there's a future for the witch, because the witch, her mode of production, it manifests itself in sort of the image of the witch, which is a witch's cauldron. It's brewing. And brewing has a fascinating history in terms of social control, because, I mean, I read this amazing piece, I'm not a narco-primitivist, but it was called a narco-primitivist history of alcohol. And one of the discussions was about how brewing was outlawed in sort of the feminine domain of witches, and then became sort of codified in medieval forms of producing beer, which is, this incredibly highly sedative hops-based drink, and then was codified into law through the German Reinheitsgebot's German purity law in the 1500s. And there's a sense in which the taking back of the witch's cauldron is a reclamation of the modes of producing social forms of care, social forms of medicine. I mean, just to take an example in the NHS right now, I mean, for example, trans people don't have health, most of them don't have healthcare in the United Kingdom. So the idea of, from the Xenofeminist Manifesto, of sort of homemade hormone production, or cultivating knowledge in communities such that they can produce their own healthcare. I think that really does fit into the idea of the return of this witch archetype that can have liberatory potentialities, not in the sense of a return, but sort of it wasn't always held in common by this patriarchal, almost church-like of structure.
Yeah. So we could say witches are living off the grid.
Yes.
But, it's interesting because I did some work on Carl Jung way back in the day. And, despite being a reactionary, I mean, Carl Jung actually has a very similar analysis of the witch as an archetype or as a trope in dreams or fairy tales and what have you, is that the witch maintains this creative power that exists on the fringe of the dominant order. And and I think maybe you mentioned this in the blog post, that, the sovereign order will burn the witch at the stake, really, of course, but also symbolically too, as a symbolic way to repress those forces which stand outside of its domain and threaten to undermine it.
So this idea of I really like the idea of the possibility of the future articulation of the witch. But there's a point that I think is really important to bring up, which is that the monsters and the Gothic generally are unstable modes of signification, right? They're signs and modes which are deeply liminal and ambiguous. Over on HV, we say all the time, horror movies are not inherently leftist or radical. They're horror writing is often prone to kind of deep reactionary politics.
Mm-hmm.
And historically, that's because a lot of English Gothic writing emerged out of reactionary fears about the French Revolution. The reactionaries have their own monsters too, right? So in the context of the witch, yes, we could talk about the forward articulation of trans people concocting their own hormone therapy or out of the grid of capitalist health systems. But we could also talk about the ways in which you have those ideas of the liberal co-option of the witch. We are the daughters of the witches that you couldn't burn, as a kind of slogan of liberal girl bossing. So even though that there is emancipatory potential within monsters, monsters are unstable, which is why any kind of Gothic Marxism completely rejects this idea of easy determinism or easy causality. But the whole point is to not be, it isn't just about a set of aesthetics that you appropriate. It's about understanding the valence and capacity of these as both cultural signs and political catalysts.
The figure of the witch, I think, is fascinating precisely because the witch enters and leaves a discourse on power, just as we start to see the manifestations of discourses, of renewed discourses on confession, on possession, come into play. And I love the way in which you use the figure of the zombie here as sort of an opposition to this idea of the monster having to be this ultimate exteriority. Not that it has to be this imperceivable Lovecraftian abomination, but it actually sits right next to you and you look at your hands and you're like, my goodness, like I'm turning too, or it's already too late, right? So when we talk about monster production or producing the monster, we're talking about all of these different models of subject production. So monster production has this dual function of being a process by which we all become better laborers, even better consumers. But then at the same time, once we hit this sort of spectacular limit, then whatever we've done, whatever monster we've become, can be disregarded as such, right? Oh, no, 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 he's just a monster. He's an aberration. This isn't actually what capital is built to produce, right? The embezzling employee or this or that, right? So the monster is able to produce precisely what it is able to disavow, such that this, like, I hate to use this word, the structure can be maintained. So I love the way in which these three pieces sort of shift towards from horror to a sort of eerie solidarity that we have to maintain with this monster. But I was wondering if, because of this, you could extend a little bit more on what this sort of, what raising the specter of possibility of a better world would entail, precisely insofar as how would this specter start to become clearer through a history of the violence of monstrosity in capital.
So this is a really interesting question. And to pick up on what you were saying, firstly, let's talk about Shaun of the Dead, right? Shaun of the Dead is a great British zombie, a rom-com.
Amazing.
And the opening montage is a kind of like, it's a montage of different shots of like people commuting to work, scanning goods in the supermarket, waiting at the bus stop. And it's like, really, Britain didn't really notice it was sliding into the zombie apocalypse because we were kind of there already, you know? So there's this kind of interstitial stage where to be part of the horde of people queuing up for the Black Friday sale is fine, but when the zombie outbreak turns up, you know, the supermarket or the mall becomes like a grave waiting to happen. So the bigger point that's kind of important to talk about here, I think, is I wrote a paper on Thomas Ligotti and the concept of acid communism. Thomas Ligotti is a really interesting horror short story writer, deeply pessimistic about the possibility. Like, would probably think that any kind of emancipatory potential here is like absolutely ridiculously short-sighted. But Ligotti is useful precisely in as much as pointing out that if capitalism has a kind of set of traumas attached to it, any movement beyond that, like revolution, whatever term you want to put on it, is going to contain within it its own kind of traumatic risk, right? Moving beyond capitalism is not necessarily, utopia is not necessarily an easy or pleasant thing. And Ligotti's short stories raise the possibility that if you were confronted with the option of becoming a new kind of subject, you might find that idea completely horrifying. You know, this idea of a kind of freedom beyond the structures of capitalism, we might go, yeah, that's what we all. No, actually, there's a degree to which isn't that a nightmare? Isn't that something that like opens the door onto all kinds of interesting fears? So this is an area that I think there's kind of lots of work to be done in. But I think that's kind of the line that I would go down to kind of answer what you were talking about.
Yeah, and I think this like question of like where to go is super important too, because when we look at Jacobin and anti-Jacobin literature after the French Revolution, we start to see sort of new kinds of like Marie Antoinette becoming a figure of a cannibalistic, incestuous behavior, anti-Jacobin literature describing Jacobins as like cannibals in the night that come in to eat, you know, small children. So all of these whatever you want to call it, like revolution. It doesn't these moments of a burst of social order where something finally explodes often can just produce its own monstrosities and its own systems of monster dash producing.
Yes.
So
yeah.
so I think like it's a really important point to make.
Yeah, this again brings us back to the kind of instability, right? This is, if we talk about those moments of rupture, which is the way that I would think of them, those kind of bursts in the continuity, right? When everything kind of shatters for a second, or what Badiou would refer to as the event. Yes, there will be new kinds of monsters produced, or rather, there will be new monsters which are co-opted and interpreted and put to work in different capacities, right? So the zombie is the great example here, right? The zombie is both the horde that comes to devour the empire of capitalism, but is also the laborer that can be put to work in the service of that same capitalist enterprise. Like, what happens to the zombies at the end of Shaun of the Dead? They're a pool of cheap, easily usable labor. So again, we're back to this question of instability, and to have an understanding of that is, as you point out, super important.
Honestly, I've just been enjoying listening to a conversation so far, and so most of my sort of questions have been, I think, articulated already. So one of the sort of common ways I think of thinking about monsters from perspective of something like a Gothic Marxism or people on the left that I've seen is that we can understand not just the particular figures that monsters take, but the ways in which the popularity or the significance of those monsters changes over time in different cultures with different histories and so on, can be understood as the unconscious of capital, the kind of fears and anxieties which plague that given society, find a certain cultural expression in particular forms. So you might find that in certain times, the vampire plays a particularly important role in literature and film and so on. Whereas you might find that you looked at another period of time, even in the same country, it might be zombies. I mean, we're living through a time when zombies are clearly sort of the most popular monster product, I suppose. So is that a sort of one fair way of reading it? And also I'm wondering, what do we do with these sort of horrific figures, these these zombies, these vampires, and the metaphors that you find and imagery you find in Marx and so on? What does it mean for us, I suppose? Is it something to be understood as a sort of expression of some of the fears in late capitalist society, or is it more than that?
Yeah, so like let's take the figure of the vampire, for example. So if you look from the publication of Bram Stoker's Dracula in 1898, we get a big vampire adaptation. We get a big Dracula. We get a big vampire text roughly once a decade, either on stage or in film. And it is super interesting to see the ways in which monsters are kind of like hermeneutically plastic. You know, they are a set shape, but they have a kind of like flexibility in them, in which you can kind of process and explore the fears of a given cultural moment. So, for example, the figure of the zombie I think is really interesting. So we can talk about things like Romero's zombie movies of the 70s and the countercultural and actually quite leftist critique of consumerism versus the kind of rancid cynicism of something like The Walking Dead, which is to my mind just a genuinely bleak show about how cops love to shoot brown people in the head. Like, even at the end of the world, we still have a cop. That's the vision of the apocalypse that The Walking Dead points out. This kind of just foul-tasting, cynical, reactionary show that kind of fetishizes its own despair, but is profoundly fitting for the broader cultural condition from which it emerges, right? And this is what I think ties into the second part of your question, which is like, so what do we do, right? What's the whole point of this? Is this just kind of cool aesthetics? And I would go, yes, there is an aesthetic capacity here, but there is also a kind of existential and maybe even sort of approaching the kind of culturally therapeutic aspect, right? So we can go, yes, this is about understanding the ways in which various fears are ingrained into the cultural imagination on a kind of mass level, and how those have shifted historically And through that, you know, I think the point is to be like, okay, what does that mean for our understanding of the subject as it's developed through capitalism and through capitalist history? Monsters shift their meaning, but they pick up new meanings as our own kinds of subjectivity shift along with them.
So I was really interested in this. I was reading your articles about this and thinking about it. Because on the one hand, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, particularly if you go back to Marx's own writing, it's surprising how often he returns to this kind of imagery, this sort of literary references throughout Capital, right? Often talks about vampires, and even when he talks about the commodity, he talks about its sort of strange mystical qualities, you know. But one of my thoughts as I was hearing you talk there was that almost immediately it seems to be we move to the level in which we're talking always already about ideology as well, right? Because insofar as what we're talking about is one of the forms in which perhaps the fears and anxieties of late capitalist society find a particular cultural expression as a sort of mediating figure of those fears. Of course, it finds many different sort of forms. It might take the form of the Gothic or the horrifying, but there are also the kinds of films and books and so on that we more immediately think of when we think about ideology or propaganda. We think about the ways in which one great example I always think of is the birth of the cyberpunk genre. Although we now think of it many sort of Blade Runner films with these sort of references to sort of Japanese businesses and sort of the glowing neon lights and the kanji on the neon lights, on all these different things, it was a very clear expression of American anxieties about the rapid development of Japan at that time and its threats or economic threat to the US. So there's always these different sort of levels on which these anxieties seem to play out, whether that's about Japan at that particular point, Russia and in the Cold War and so on. It seems to operate on all these different levels. And I think, Gothic Marxism seems to be an interesting way of trying to think about at least one of those areas, right, where what's going on here when we see this imagery, these popularity of these films and so on.
There's a great article by people I won't name in Gothic Studies that was quite dismissive of this idea that like Gothic or horror reflects the cultural anxieties of a particular moment. Then the authors went, oh no. Like the point is that it's scary, and it's like, hang on, no, like fear is not this kind of ahistorical construct, right? What we find anxiety inducing depends upon our social being, right? Our kind of conscious experience is dependent upon. So, like let's the zombie in the post 2000s. A really good example of what you're talking about here is the prevalence of what was kind of derisively referred to as torture porn post 2001. So, a great example of this would be something like Eli Roth's Hostel. So you have Americans in former Eastern Soviet republics being brutally tortured, specifically after 2001 9/11, right? There is a kind of historical link here between an event which had a huge impact on the cultural imagination, and like immediate post 2001, post 9/11 American culture is so deeply weird and strange. And a lot of those fears get processed into horror, and specifically around corporeal fragility, right? Bodies that can be torn apart, bodies that can be immolated, that can be tortured. So like, let's put this in the context of COVID, right? The initial reading would be to expect a big upsurge in kind of viral horror, infection horror. The body is this kind of site of disease and distress. But to be honest, I think we're probably still too close to the immediacy of that. And you'll see that, almost certainly you'll see that in like the next 10 years. That's going to be a feature of horror. A big thing that's resurged lately in horror film is folk horror, right? Folk horror is about, I'm writing a video about folk horror at the moment and capitalist ideology, because folk horror is about the possibility of an encounter with a kind of weird agency that reorders one's conception of the world. And right, we live in very precarious times that are economically unstable, politically unstable, violent. So it kind of makes sense, right, that there would be this kind of uptick in films which are about going, actually, here is the secret, here is the thing behind the world that actually orders it, and it's ordered on this kind of metaphysical foundation of ritual or rite or violence. And of course, the kind of, we can take this to the next level, which is to go, but what if it isn't an agency out there? We're not outside of this ideology. It's an ideology that is actually, maybe the monster is not out there in the woods. Maybe it's very close. Maybe it's actually even under the skin of the subject already. So like, this is what I mean by saying, like, yes, the historical shifts are really important. And I think it's going to be interesting. You can absolutely dig down into the kind of molecular structures of history to see the ways in which the popular cultural imagination has kind of shifted in response to, as I understand it, the kind of various traumatic structural shifts of capitalism itself.
One point to make about The Walking Dead, actually, because when you mentioned it, it at one point did strike me, and this is going to be like my meta-critique of The Walking Dead, in that the reason why they're always called walkers is because Kirkman has specified this. There is no such thing as zombie literature or the idea of a zombie in that world. Now, if you take it back to its presupposition, that meant there wasn't really so much of a, because it originates in Haitian Vodun culture. Okay, what does this mean? Does this mean that the Haitian Revolution Haiti doesn't exist in the world of Walking Dead, and therefore the forces of imperialism had to contest with a world historical event of a slave revolution? Is this sort of the complete erasure of the fundamental challenge to Western imperialist hegemony from one of its most pivotal revolutionary events? And it does seem like bringing everyone under the figure of the cop is this a pre-ideological move, because essentially the world of The Walking Dead presupposes that the Haitian Revolution never happened. And it's that ultimate suppression in which, okay, who can unite everybody then? It's just the contingency of, this is dude Rick. And there's that sense of which, in a way, horror doesn't exist in the world of The Walking Dead. And that's why it's ultimately unconvincing. It's simply a law and order drama, and eventually some zombie show up. And I think horror actually has that function, in at least the contemporary milieu, of bringing out the contradictions in a more flesh form. Even when Rick says, "Oh, look, we are The Walking Dead." Well, yeah, it's from the mouth of a cop ultimately, and the world historical presuppositions of this TV drama are fundamentally reactionary. But I think this is a really good
favorite movie lines, right? Where they Photoshop like fake lines where they say the actual title on Twitter. Favorite movie lines, but they actually say it in the TV show.
What if we were the real Hellraiser the entire time by opening the box?
Do you get it? Do you? But I actually really like that point about the origins of the zombie. Right, the zombie is co-opted. It's travel writers who travel to the Caribbean and to Haiti, and who first bring back stories of Vodun and kind of magic and ritual, and is kind of fed into syncretism around the kind of developing of like pulp horror stories in the early 20th century. And again, it underscores the ways in which, right, that kind of monstrosity is also a sign of rupture. It's a sign of the break of the continuity. It has a kind of not absolute meaning, but a kind of potentiality that even in that co-option can never be fully erased.
I think a way to take us down the home stretch towards the end of the episode is maybe to talk a little bit more about movies and our favorite horror movies and how they resonate with either our understanding of capitalism, of sovereignty, of domination. And I kind of wanted to point out a bit earlier in relation to Matt's question. Matt's question was like, why should we do this? Is it just cool aesthetics? Is this useful in any aspect? And I was recently reading Jason Reed's paper, Man is a Werewolf to Man. I posted it on the timeline. It'll be in the show notes when we're done with this episode here. But it got me thinking about how, like, what is the most apt metaphor, for example, to talk about the very abstract nature of capital in its ability not only to capture and produce subjectivities, but also take hold of the apparatus that produces subjectivities itself. And it brought me back to Mark Fisher and his In Capitalist Realism, where he talks about John Carpenter's The Thing. And I think, in terms of trying to convince somebody or to illuminate, like, what is capital doing? I think that particular movie is very apt at providing us with a very rich metaphor by which to talk about that sort of thing, because capital has this very plastic aspect to it. It metabolizes everything it touches, it absorbs everything into it. It can take something that's completely recognizable and turn it against you. Different sort of horror tropes do this in different ways. I mean, when we were talking about Frankenstein earlier, we have this Promethean will to create, I am a man, I am going to create this monster who then turns back against us. I mean, the Thing does that in its own way, but what I like about The Thing is that I think the themes of this film really capture that sort of amorphous quality that capital as an abstraction expresses in the proliferation of itself. With that said, maybe we'll kind of go down the line with everybody, and you can respond to that too, John, but I was wondering if there's any particular movies that stand out in your mind as a go-to for talking about capital.
Yeah, I completely agree with you about Fisher's point on John Carpenter's The Thing, which is just an incredibly satisfying, scary movie.
Oh, absolutely.
I was talking to someone about this, and as I pointed out, we didn't get into horror movies because we wanted to talk about like abstract critiques of ideology. We got into horror movies because horror movies are fucking cool.
That's right.
And it's a really, really good scary movie. One thing that I really like is another Carpenter film is Halloween.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because we talked about this on Horror Vanguard. The original Halloween is about this kind of like nameless violence that exists under the surface of bourgeois domesticity. Right, suburbia is this kind of perfect enclave of like normative capitalist values. You know, the reproduction of the nuclear family, the acquisition of personal private property, and the accumulation of your own capital. But all of this, there's this kind of like ontological void, which is Michael Myers, who one day can kind of like literally smash down the door and murder your parents in front of you. So I really think that's a really valuable and kind of like rich source of talking about suburbia, you know, where it seems very removed from the kind of like it's, you know, the violence of capitalism gets obfuscated, gets kind of drawn behind a veil when you're thinking of depictions of suburbia. But even there, right, you just peel away the surface, and there's this kind of like teeming mass of like libidinal violence that drives everything, that holds everything together. So yeah, Carpenter, the Gothic Marxist film director, kind of par excellence, in my opinion.
Adam, I'm sure you want to go next.
I'll let everyone else do some stuff now. I'll come in last because I've got a long diatribe about certain films.
How about Will?
Obviously, I think that horror movies historically always do a good job of capturing the period that they're produced, right? They're uniquely capable of being some sort of thermometer. And it's not a profound thing to say that The Exorcist captures the anxieties of a post-evangelical America, or that, you know, Dawn of the Dead and Night of the Living Dead manifest, again, parts of how we, I not so much just to outsource the horrors of capitalism, but also like the horrors of consumer culture too. We just push it, we indefinitely push it off, and eventually it comes back to hit us. And we find these films to be to allow us to find some sort of manifest truth in them, even in their simplicity. But also films like Under the Skin too, I think, have been helpful for working through the ways in which we understand subjectivity. And I think Under the Skin does a great job of showing just how foreign we are to our own processes of becoming ourselves. Yeah, I mean, obviously, if there was one thing in this that I think is important, is that I still think the figure of the zombie in those three essays, I think, becomes an extraordinarily important way to understand particularly solidarity, but also like the disabling effects of capital, and the way in which films and TV shows that are more aligned with like The Walking Dead treat the figure of the zombie, rather than films like The Cured, where the zombie gets to be us and we get to destroy it, but it also operates in such a way that like it's produced by usually some elements of industrialized society, and then it creates a schism. And I think that these uncomfortable solidarities are solidarities precisely because they're uncomfortable, right? Because it requires a sort of refusal of ourselves in order to accept that we are also the zombie, right? So it's a destitution of the self in order to recognize the self in these sort of other spaces. So yeah, I think that some horror films that deal with sort of alien, and maybe Under the Skin's not a horror film, right? But yeah, I would say it is. But I would say that those are probably the films for me recently that have had, other than things obviously like Parasite, where it's very clear that this is a massive critique of capital. But yeah, those are my films.
Matt, what's your go-to?
So I've only recently, the last few years, gotten into horror films. I think for a long time I was just too much of a scaredy cat. Like I couldn't quite handle them. But my go-to sort of absolute favorite horror film has to be Alien. I can just watch that film over and over and over again. It almost gets better every time as well. And I'm not necessarily caught up on sort of how that film has been sort of written about or thought about, received, or anything like that. But it always seemed to me that you could definitely you could sort of read in and think about some issues like sort of the corporate exploitation of both of people who work for them and of natural resources, sort of the dangers of development of nuclear weapons and so on, weapons of mass destruction. But primarily, it's just a fucking amazing film. So that's my sort of go-to. More recently, was talked about earlier in this episode, The Witch, most recent one. I really, really love that film. It's interesting because for me to be partly because it doesn't rely on a lot of more common tropes in horror films. There's almost no violence at all. At least, and where it does appear, it's often obscured or not shown in a clear way. It's mainly about this strange and unsettling atmosphere that just gets in under your skin, I think. But I also I really enjoyed the way that it wasn't trying to be this sort of tale of like female empowerment per se. It was, I felt it was trying to say something more about the predicament of it, the way in which religion functioned to regulate in increasingly strict and harsh ways. Firstly, everyone's bodies, but primarily for the film, female bodies, women's bodies, and so on, and the sort of the anxiety that is provoked by the risk of women taking control of their own sexuality, for example. So I really enjoyed that film, partly for its horror elements, but also, and it's really interesting horror elements, but also there's some really interesting themes going on there too. And my final one was one that Will mentioned. I mean, Parasite, like A, isn't normally considered a horror film. B, it almost feels a bit rote bringing up Parasite on like a leftist podcast. Like we're all meant to love this film and so on. Like I really love that film. I saw it like 4 times in the cinemas, and that film is really, really amazing. Firstly, because it's probably the best depiction of class conflict I've seen in cinema, particularly because it focuses on structural forces rather than individual morality. And so I was really disheartened when I saw so many people who like saw that film, came out of cinema and went, "Oh, so the parasites were the family downstairs, right?" Or even vice versa, because I saw so many of it. It was so frustrating, right? Because the whole point is that if you think it's either of these families, you haven't understood the film. It's not about what they're individually choosing to do, whether they're evil, whether they're nasty, or whatever. And there's this ghost haunting the entire film, of course, right? And the ghost is precisely the unacknowledged, unremunerated, and exploited labor of an invisible, impoverished, and increasingly impoverished family, and largely more other sets of families. And so the film tips over from this sort of almost funny sort of escape or heist film in a way, right? Like they're sort of tricking the family, and I can never figure out exactly where it happens, but there's a certain point in that film where it just switches and it all starts going downhill, and the figures of these ghosts haunting this entire house and this family start returning. They start coming up from the stairs and so on, right? So I definitely felt there was some really interesting horror elements to that film, as well as, again, just I think, in my opinion, one of the best sort of analyses of sort of contemporary capitalism in film. So those are my 3: The Witch, Alien, and Parasite, with a sort of asterisk next to it.
I guess I'll do mine before Adam goes. I'm a little bit older than all of you, and I had the benefit of growing up as a child in the 1980s. So I was able to watch creature double features on like 3 channels on a Saturday afternoon. And my parents were relentless horror watchers as well. And they're also very cruel to me. My dad used to sit me on his lap and force me to watch the film without allowing me to put the pillow in front of my face. So I was freebasing horror, if that's the right metaphor there. But I don't know if any of you have heard of this film. I might have talked about it before. 1979, Tourist Trap. Have you seen that film? Put it on your list for sure, John. It's kind of a ripoff of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It's in a way, there's a lot of the same tropes. But I was doing my little meditation on horror films today, and it made me realize how many horror films in like the late 70s and early 80s started out with like a bunch of teenagers running out of gas. And there's definitely something there. And it just made me realize, that's just on the heels of the gas crisis. And I mean, the car itself is an emblem of American strength and superiority. And so for us to run out of the gas, that's what instigates the horror. And in this particular film, what we have is a group of teenagers. I think there's like one hippie, there's kind of the jock in there, everybody's in. And then when they pull over, there's basically a gas station there that turns out to be an aging roadside attraction. What's interesting is it's all these puppets of like Custer's Last Stand and all these US history dioramas that come to life. And they're all really cheesy, but it made me think like, wow, what's happening here? It's almost like this parody of American history come to life as these little mannequins. And it's all held together by Chuck Connors. If you know who the rifleman is, that's going way back. But anyway, Chuck Connors is this sort of authoritarian, like paternal figure. And he's the creator of the show. And what we find out in the movie is he ends up killing off everybody in the movie and turning them into mannequins. And so what he does too is he recreates the sort of familial tableau. He basically creates like a little grandmother and a mother. And the horror aspect of the film is to be turned into a member of this family as a mannequin through his paternal powers. And what I love about the movie, he has these very understated telekinetic abilities that they don't really talk about, as if the power of the father as a telekinetic is one that's just so subtly emanated. And it's a wonderful movie. It's totally campy, but there's actually some really horrific parts in it too. So go out there and grab Tourist Trap.
This sounds like absolutely something we need to cover on Horror Vanguard.
Get me on. I'll rock that.
Let's do it. That sounds amazing. And yeah, so many of those 70s films directly tied to like the OPEC crisis, right? And of course, the mid 70s being the date that people like Jameson and other theorists pin as the beginnings of neoliberalism proper. So like all of these things kind of intersect, and again, this is all about horror. Is about the kind of phenomenological experience of living through that.
And here comes the grand finale. Adam's going to talk about.
Okay. There's 3 things I want to talk about. One, I mean, the first one is going to be Dawn of the Dead, because I really like how essentially the zombies they're kind of superfluous to the film, because they aren't particularly dangerous if you know how to handle them. Because in the first scenes of the movie, I mean, you find out essentially you can if you get rid of bodies quickly, it's fine. People die all the time. It's just managing in a way of dead bodies. But also, I mean, the first outbreak of zombies we see is when a racist cop breaks down the door and starts shooting people randomly. I mean, he'll go down into the basement after all these zombies have been released. And then, well, there's this disabled priest who'd be able to give them all the last rites anyway. I mean, they were perfectly manageable as long as you know how to deal with them. When they first get to the mall, they have enough supplies to last for years, but they keep going down because they like so many trinkets, and it ends up, completely destroying them. I mean, the police all bug out, society bugs out, all of the media bugs out. Everyone's too busy on getting media hype to listen to anyone about how to fix any of them. Not to be too technocratic, but the zombies are kind of window dressing. And I think that's how society responds to really quite manageable public health crises is a good way of thinking, but also about how we don't want to respond to them. I mean, I like a trip to the pub as much as anyone, but there are certain times we should and shouldn't have been going. But another one I like is His House, It's an amazing ghost story on Netflix. It's for these two refugees who come to England, go through the horrific discriminatory migration system, the asylum system, are given this house, and they are haunted by sort of apparitions of people they've lost along the way and sort of the things they had to do to get there. And it really brings this point of solidarity. Eventually, they learn to live with these ghosts, and they form a sort of solidarity. They are part of the family. They are part of their journey. But my favorite thing, talk about capital and this overarching theme of Gothic Marxism, which is the solidarity with the monster. It's not a film. It's a comic. It's Alan Moore's comic Providence, and the particular way which he describes the people of Innsmouth from the Lovecraft story Shadow over Innsmouth. These people who are just a remote fishing village, aren't particularly hostile. They just made a deal with some fish people down the road, well, down the stream, and started having kids with them, started trading with them, and then they are monstered. They are made to be completely insane, or they have a completely functioning, happy communal life, their own religion, their own customs. And at the end, Lovecraft sums it up as the monster of miscegenation. It's a eugenicist horror, and eventually what happens is the US government shows up, and for no other reason than these people are simply different. I mean, they're persecuted in a manner. In the comic, there's people drawing swastikas on their houses, and all they do is have a slightly different culture. And they eventually all herded up into concentration camps. It's a horrific way of monstering the other, and I think this has come in a way that's returned quite fascinatingly with films like Guillermo del Toro's The Shape of Water, in which we don't have only solidarity of the monster. I mean, we might have a few things as well, but the monster is also that McCarthyism, the Cold War, the system by which the non-standard body or the non-standard subject is confined as a kind of as a monstrous extremity to be tortured and also tested. I guess that would sort of be my three films to come back to, the sort of monsters we can have solidarity with. And just as a final thing, I think a good text to think about the limits of monsters as an epistemological category. Psychoanalysis has been taken to the cleaners by Paul Preciado. His book, Can the Monster Speak? This monster, the limit of all these categories. It's not only the return of these categories in the non-binary body, but also the result. It has to sort of build itself from the violence under which sexual categories and gender categories were created in the early 19th century in the colonial era.
Awesome. So, John, we're heading down the home stretch at the very last portion here. I would like you to talk about some stuff that you're working on right now. And evidently you're doing some writing related to the recent and popular Squid Game. Is that correct?
Yeah. So I'm working on two videos over on YouTube, one on folk horror and capitalist ideology. The other is going to be on the Saw franchise and insurance. And I'm also working on a piece which will hopefully be out around Halloween on the Netflix show Squid Game and Debt, and the ways in which Squid Game ties into this genealogy of something like Parasite, which is very obviously and very immediately and straightforwardly about what you all think it's about. But what's so interesting to me is the way in which the kind of meta discourse around the show is trying to read it in a very paranoid way, trying to read it against itself, to be like, actually, there was a headline which was what Squid Game is about, shows the value of globalization and free trade.
Yeah.
And it's like there's this kind of desperate need to disavow the very immediate, obvious, and very straightforward content.
Yeah.
As I put it, capitalist realism has its own paranoid reading. It's desperately trying to go, but it's not that. It's not the thing which it so obviously is. It is a monstrous text in the kind of discourse of kind of cultural criticism. And what I want to talk about is the ways in which debt is essentially a Gothic construct. Debt is about the limitation of agency. If you are like me, someone with lots of debt, you do not have freedom to travel, or if you are in debt and can't afford health insurance, you might end up getting sick and dying, or you might have your property repossessed, or you might be homeless. Debt is about it rests upon this dual movement of promising you future choice. You borrow now so you can get A, B, C. You borrow. Cheap credit is cheap because you can live flexibly, but it actually narrows and destroys human agency, right? All of the people in the Squid Game are there because, as the game organizers put it, they literally have no choices. Even though Squid Game presents itself as if you've seen the first couple of episodes, you'll know this. It presents itself as very democratic, right? It gives them a choice. But really, of course, the economic conditions that they exist under means they have democracy is merely a sham, right? It's a different configuration of the same kinds of violence, which is why even when people leave, they're desperate to come back, because what difference does it make? So I'm trying to kind of like work through, firstly, why people are so reluctant to acknowledge, particularly a lot of South Korean culture, lots of Bong Joon-ho's films, things like Squid Game, as being very obviously about a critique of neoliberal capitalism, financial capitalism, debt, class conflict, and the ways in which debt is a Gothic structure that underpins a lot of kind of late liquid capitalism that we exist in.
I was so happy to have landed on McNally's book over the past few days, because where he talks about this notion of doubling and Marx, I think works very well with an analysis of Squid Game, because what you see is you have one world, which essentially the real world, as it were, versus the world of the games, as being cut in sharper relief anyway, what structural coercion can do. And the irony of the film is that the players, well, as we find out, opt for that world, the more explicit world, rather than the more amorphous and miasmic world of real life neoliberal capital.
Yeah, at least it's honest, right?
Exactly.
You might get shot to death, but at least you could see the bullet coming.
Right.
Right. All it takes is for a letter to arrive from the bank to literally destroy your life, and you might never see that coming. So at least in Squid Game, you know the rules, and at least it's honest about it.